You know exactly what you just did wrong, not vaguely, not after someone points it out. You knew the moment it happened. You replayed it before the other person even left the room. You caught the micro expression on their face, clocked the slight shift in their tone, and already began constructing a full post-mortem of the interaction before you even said goodbye. That is not normal. Most people do not do that. Most people go home and sleep. You go home and audit. Welcome to the strange, exhausting, quietly extraordinary world of high self-awareness. Here is what nobody tells you. Self-awareness is supposed to be a virtue. Every self-help book, every performance review, every therapy session in the world will tell you to be more self-aware. Know yourself. Understand your triggers. Reflect on your behavior. They say it like it is a destination, like there is a comfortable level of self-awareness you reach, and then you simply live there, calm and wise. But the real answer is far stranger, because for the people who actually have it, genuine, deep, relentless self-awareness, it is not a destination. It is a condition, and it changes everything. The way you make decisions, the way you experience failure, the way other people perceive you, the way you perceive yourself. And buried inside all of that, there is a paradox so sharp it could cut glass. The clearer you can see yourself, the harder it becomes to be yourself. Let us start at the beginning. What is self-awareness, actually? In 1972, psychologists Shelley Duvall and Robert Wickland published a theory that would reshape how scientists think about the human mind. They called it objective self-awareness theory. The idea was simple and devastating. When your attention turns inward, when your focus shifts from the world around you to yourself, you enter a state of self-evaluation. You compare who you are in this moment to an internal standard of who you believe you should be. And in almost every case, there is a gap. The standard is high. The reality falls short. You notice the gap, and the noticing produces discomfort. This is what Duvall and Wickland called objective self-awareness, not awareness of your strengths, not a warm, affirming knowledge of your worth, but an almost clinical, detached observation of yourself, like watching your own behavior on a slow-motion security camera. Most people experience this occasionally. High self-awareness people live there. But here's what took researchers decades to understand. Self-awareness is not one thing. There are two completely different types, and most people who study the subject confuse them constantly. Tasha Eurich, an organizational psychologist and researcher who conducted one of the largest studies on self-awareness ever performed, identified the critical distinction. Internal self-awareness is your ability to see your own values, thoughts, feelings, and patterns clearly. External self-awareness is your ability to understand how other people perceive you. And these two types, Eurich found, are completely independent. You can have one without the other. What her research discovered, and this is the part that should make you stop, is that only about 15% of people are truly self-aware in both dimensions. 15%, despite the fact that 95% of people believe they are self-aware. High self-awareness, then, is not something most people actually have. It is something most people believe they have, while exhibiting almost none of it. And the people who genuinely possess it are often the last ones to claim it confidently. Now let us talk about the brain. When you observe yourself, you are activating a network of regions that neuroscientists call the default mode network. This is the brain's introspective system. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and several other structures. This network activates when you think about yourself, when you remember past experiences involving yourself, when you imagine your own future, when you try to understand what others think of you. In short, it is the neural infrastructure of self-reflection. Research by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA showed that the more active this network is, the more intensely a person processes social and emotional information about themselves. Highly self-aware people do not just think about themselves more, they think about themselves more deeply, with greater nuance, with more emotional resolution, and with a much longer time horizon. They are not just asking what just happened. They are asking, what does this mean about who I am? What pattern does this fit? What does this predict about my future and what would a better version of me have done? That is an enormous amount of cognitive processing, and it never quite stops. Here's where it gets interesting. Studies by Anthony Sylvia and Timothy Engel showed that people in states of high self-focused attention perform significantly better on complex cognitive tasks. They catch more of their own errors, they self-correct faster, they are less likely to act impulsively, and more likely to behave in alignment with their stated values. In a measured, structured environment, high self-awareness is a genuine cognitive advantage. It makes you better at your job, better at keeping commitments, better at regulating emotional responses. But outside the lab, the picture changes. In real life, the same mechanism that makes you catch your errors before anyone else does also makes you experience failure in an unusually acute way. You do not just fail. You observe yourself failing. You feel the failure, and then you watch yourself feeling the failure. And then you begin to evaluate whether the way you are responding to the failure is itself a failure. This recursive loop of self-observation is not always useful. Sometimes it is the cognitive equivalent of staring at a wound so intensely that it never closes. Researchers call this maladaptive self-focus. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema spent decades studying the phenomenon of rumination, the tendency to repeatedly replay and analyze distressing experiences. Her work showed that people who engage in high levels of self-focused rumination are significantly more vulnerable to depression, anxiety, and impaired problem solving. Not because they are weaker, because the same capacity that gives them depth also gives them nowhere to hide from their own patterns. And here is the paradox that lives at the center of all of this. High self-awareness gives you an exceptional ability to understand your behavior. But understanding your behavior and being able to change it are not the same thing. You can watch yourself do the exact same thing for the 14th time and know, with precise clarity, exactly why you are doing it, what childhood pattern it connects to, what fear is driving it, and what you should do differently. You can know all of that and still do it, because insight and transformation are different muscles. Knowledge is not immunity. That gap between seeing clearly and living differently is where highly self-aware people often suffer the most quietly. Let us talk about relationships. When you are highly self-aware, you bring an unusual set of capacities to every interaction. You monitor your own tone. You notice when your words land differently than you intended. You pick up on other people's emotional shifts and recalibrate your behavior in real time. You remember what you said 3 conversations ago and how it connects to what is being said now. You hold yourself accountable at a standard that most people around you simply do not apply to themselves. This sounds useful, and in some ways, it is. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people with higher levels of self-awareness were rated by their colleagues and partners as more trustworthy, more empathetic, and more effective communicators. They were also significantly more likely to apologize meaningfully, and not as a social ritual, but because they genuinely registered when they caused harm and felt the weight of it. But here is the other side of that coin. When you hold yourself to a high internal standard, you do not always keep that standard contained to yourself. Over time, often without realizing it, highly self-aware people begin to extend the same evaluative gaze outward. You start noticing when others are not self-aware. When someone repeats the same defensive pattern without any recognition of it. When someone explains away their behavior without examining it. When someone hurts people and seems genuinely unbothered. What began as insight into yourself can slowly become an almost involuntary audit of everyone around you. This does not make you judgmental in the crude sense. You are not crueler, but you are sharper. And that sharpness can create a loneliness that is very specific. It is not that you lack connection. It is that you feel most at home with people who can meet you at the level of examination you apply to yourself. And those people are, as the research shows, genuinely rare. Tasha Eurich's studies found something that confirms this. People who are high in both internal and external self-awareness tend to have smaller but more intensely close social networks. They choose depth over breadth, not because they are antisocial, but because surface-level interaction, performed without any reflection on either side, eventually stops feeling like contact at all. Now let us go deeper into something that almost no one talks about. High self-awareness changes your relationship with identity. Most people have a fairly stable, if somewhat unexamined, sense of who they are. They operate from a set of beliefs about themselves that they rarely question. They are confident, they say, or they are creative, or they are the kind of person who does not give up. These self-concepts function as anchors. They stabilize behavior. They make it easy to make decisions without too much deliberation. When you have high self-awareness, those anchors loosen, because the moment you start seeing your own patterns with precision, you start noticing that your patterns are not always consistent. The version of you that exists in a comfortable environment is not identical to the version that emerges under pressure. The way you treat strangers is not always the way you treat the people you love most. You notice the gaps between your stated values and your actual behavior. You see the specific situations that reveal your least flattering tendencies. You watch yourself perform identity rather than simply inhabit it. This can produce what psychologist Dan McAdams calls narrative complexity, a rich, layered sense of self that holds contradictions without collapsing. This is associated with greater psychological flexibility, greater resilience under stress, and a more nuanced understanding of other people. It is a strength, but it comes with a cost. A simple, stable identity gives you the comfort of knowing exactly who you are. A complex, examined one gives you accuracy, and accuracy is not always comfortable. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset touches the edge of this. Her work showed that people who see their qualities as fluid and changeable are more resilient in the face of failure than people who see themselves as fixed. Highly self-aware individuals tend naturally toward this growth orientation, not because they are optimistic, but because they have watched themselves change enough to believe that change is real. They have caught themselves being wrong about themselves before. They know the map is not the territory. But Dweck's research also shows something else. The belief that you can always change can paradoxically make current failure feel more significant. If your traits are not fixed, then every failure is not just a bad outcome. It is data about who you are right now. And that data always demands interpretation. You do not get to say it just happened. You have to ask what it means. Let us talk about performance and ambition. In professional environments, high self-awareness is, on balance, a measurable asset. Research published in the Harvard Business Review analyzed data from thousands of leaders across industries and found that self-aware leaders consistently outperformed their less self-aware peers. They made better decisions under uncertainty. They were faster to recognize when a strategy was failing. They built stronger teams because they could accurately assess their own strengths and weaknesses and hire accordingly. They were less likely to let ego drive decisions that damaged organizations. But there is a shadow side even here. Highly self-aware people often struggle with what psychologists call analysis paralysis. When you are acutely aware of your own biases, your own blind spots, your own track record of errors, making confident decisions becomes harder because you know that past confidence was sometimes wrong. You know that the certainty you feel right now has failed you before, and so you delay. You gather more data, you run more checks, you question the question before you answer it. There is also the phenomenon researchers call the imposter experience, first described by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in 1978, which refers to the persistent internal feeling that you are not as competent as others believe you are, and that you will eventually be exposed. People high in self-awareness are not necessarily more prone to this than anyone else, but when they experience it differently because they can marshal actual evidence to interrogate the feeling. They know which of their past performances were genuinely good and which were merely lucky, and that knowledge, instead of reassuring them, can sharpen the uncertainty. They become expert witnesses against their own success. And yet, and this is the counterintuitive twist at the center of everything, highly self-aware people are also disproportionately represented among the highest performers in fields that require sustained, deliberate self-improvement. Research into deliberate practice, the process that psychologist Anders Ericsson identified as the mechanism behind elite skill development, shows that the essential ingredient is not raw talent. It is the ability to monitor your own performance in real time, identify the specific gap between what you did and what you should have done, and adjust with precision. That is at its core a description of applied self-awareness. The concert pianist who can hear every micro error in their own playing. The surgeon who debriefs themselves after every procedure. The writer who reads their own sentences with the eyes of a skeptic. High self-awareness does not make you perfect, but it makes you a more effective engine of self-correction. Over time, that compounds. The gap closes. Not completely. Not forever, but meaningfully, repeatedly, in ways that other people, watching from the outside, often cannot fully explain. Now, here is what almost no one accounts for. The emotional cost is not distributed evenly through time. When you are young and highly self-aware, the gap between who you are and who you know you could be feels enormous. You see your flaws with a clarity that your peers do not have about themselves, and it is not comforting. Research by Susan Harder on adolescent self-awareness showed that early self-reflective capacity, without the emotional regulation skills to manage what it reveals, predicts higher rates of shame, social anxiety, and depressive episodes in young people. This is important. Self-awareness is not inherently beneficial without the companion capacity to respond to what it shows you with self-compassion rather than self-condemnation. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas at Austin has spent over 2 decades researching self-compassion. Her work consistently shows that the ability to observe yourself clearly without being destroyed by what you see requires a specific emotional scaffold. It requires treating your own failures and limitations with the same basic warmth you would offer a close friend who is suffering, not excusing, not dismissing, but not weaponizing either. And here is where the distribution of cost shifts. Highly self-aware people who develop strong self-compassion alongside their self-awareness tend, over time, to report higher life satisfaction, more stable relationships, and greater psychological resilience than both their less self-aware peers and their highly self-aware peers who lack that compassion. The insight without the kindness is a scalpel without anesthesia. The insight with the kindness becomes something rarer, a capacity for honest, warm relationship with your own humanity. This is not a comfortable conclusion because self-compassion requires a kind of radical acceptance that sits in permanent tension with the evaluative impulse that defines high self-awareness. You see the gap, and then you allow the gap to exist without treating it as an emergency. That is not natural. It is a skill. And for people who live with relentless self-observation, it may be the most important skill of all. So what does this mean for you, sitting here now, recognizing yourself in some version of all of this? It means that the thing you probably thought was your flaw, the endless monitoring, the recursive self-examination, the inability to let yourself off the hook is also your most precise instrument. It is the same mechanism. You cannot have one without the other. What you can do is learn to use it with intention. Tasha Urich's research found that the most self-aware people she studied shared one specific habit. They did not just ask why. Why am I like this? Why did I do that? Why does this keep happening? The why question, she found, almost always leads back into rumination, into story, into the very recursive loops that trap highly self-aware people in their own heads. The most effective self-aware people asked what instead? What am I feeling right now? What does this pattern cost me? What would I do if I were being the person I want to be? What, not why? The what question is forward-looking. It is actionable. It takes the same depth of self-observation and redirects it from excavation to navigation. You already see yourself clearly. That is the rarest thing. The question is not whether you have the lens. You have always had the lens. Tonight, when you replay something you said or did and catch the exact moment it went sideways and feel that familiar, quiet exhaustion of watching yourself from the outside, remember that the watching is not the problem. The watching is the gift. The question is only what you do with it. And unlike most people walking around in the dark, guessing at their own motives and missing the pattern entirely, you can actually see. The most dangerous thing about you is not that you see yourself too clearly.